Good evening, everyone. We are so thrilled that the RJC is able to welcome you virtually to this evening's program, the first in a three-part series celebrating some of the incredible legacies of some of the incredible people that we lost in 2020. And in particular, tonight's program is really going to be a very special one. And for that reason, we are so thrilled that you're all here with us. Tonight's program would not be possible without the commitment of our education committee that has continued to find creative ways to inspire and educate throughout the pandemic. So I want to thank Jeff Kronish and Rivka Falk in particular for all that they do to move our shul and to inspire our membership through Torah study during this time. This virtual series is being sponsored by Betty and Fred Sugarman in memory of their fathers, Chaim Bornstein and Norman Sugarman, Zichronam Livracha. The Sugarmans as well have led the way with adult education at the RJC in person, and we thank them for their virtual support tonight, especially during this challenging year. I also want to acknowledge the many people who contributed towards this series through their registration on our donate page. We thank you for your support as well. Our focus in this series is the beginnings of processing the legacies of some of the great rabbinic personalities that we lost this year. And tonight our focus is on Rabbi Dr. Norman Lamm, Zichrono Livracha. I won't speak long about my personal recollections, but I do remember the first time I met Rabbi Lamm when he delivered Shir Klali in my first year in the Yeshiva University undergraduate program. And I remember the yeshiva learning Baba Kama and Rabbi Lamm coming to the Beis Medrash, the old YU Beis Medrash, to deliver that shir. I also remember the first time when I was on campus that there was a Chag HaSmicha, I think long before I thought I would one day be a participant in a Chag HaSmicha. And standing with my college friends in the back of Lamport Auditorium, listening to Rabbi Lamm talk about the profound relationship between Eliyahu Hanavi's service to the Jewish people and our service, the rabbis of today, and their service to the Jewish people. These few opportunities that I had to hear him and to see him from a distance were incredibly inspiring. And then I had the privilege years later to meet Rabbi Lamm in two very different contexts. The first was professionally as the assistant rabbi of the Jewish Center. And when I started, Rabbi Lamm was still a regular attendee at Morning Minyan. And in that context as well, I was able to meet Rabbi Lamm, the community rabbi, because to the members of the Jewish Center, he really was their rabbi emeritus for all these years, and they loved him and respected him in a very, very special way. But also to meet Rabbi Lamm, the person. And Rabbi Norman and Mindy Lamm were such incredible, incredible people. They were so sweet and they were so humble. They were genuine. They cared about everyone they met. And there's so many people in this world that were touched by Rabbi Lamm's kindness and his brilliance and his sensitivity just from meeting him on 86th Street, having nothing to do with his role at the shul, having nothing to do with his national role as the president of Yeshiva University. And in that sense, I think there are three different dimensions to who he was. He was an incredible person, and anyone who knew him, and certainly for his family, this terrible loss is only magnified by the fact that he was such an amazing father and grandfather, such an amazing uncle, such an amazing friend to so many. And then there were so many for whom he was their Shabbos morning, he was their sermon, he was the rabbi whose counsel they sought. And likewise, his national role and his incredibly significant role that he played in facilitating so much of Yeshiva University's sacred work, and in particular for those of us who benefited to go through both its college and smicha program, to be such a tremendous role model and set such a high bar for the rabbis of today. And for all of those reasons, celebrating Rabbi Lamm tonight with our speaker is, I think, the only way it could possibly be done. Someone who truly understands more than most all these different dimensions of who Rabbi Lamm was and what his legacy for our generation and generations to come will be. Rabbi Dr. Lamm's grandson, Rabbi Ari Lamm, who is with us this evening, is formerly the William Fishman Resident Scholar at the Jewish Center. He's a graduate of Yeshiva University. He earned an MA as a Fulbright Scholar in Jewish Studies and Eastern Christianity from University College in London, and a master's from Princeton University in religion. He is a musmach of the Yeshivas Rabbeinu Yitzchak Elchanan of our Smicha program, and he has completed his PhD in ancient Judaism and Christianity at Princeton. Rabbi Lamm recently served as a special advisor to the president of Yeshiva University, to Rabbi Dr. Ari Berman, and currently serves as the CEO of the Bnai Zion Foundation. So it's a very special personal privilege for me to welcome my friend and colleague, Rabbi Ari Lamm, this evening. And I want to let everyone know that our program is being recorded, and following the program, you can submit your questions. You can submit them at any time through the chat. And when Rabbi Lamm is done with his presentation, I'll be happy to read off some of those questions and give him a chance to answer them. Thank you so much. We'll turn it over to Rabbi Dr. Ari Lamm.
Can you all hear me? Thumbs up. Perfect. First of all, it is a tremendous privilege to join the Riverdale community, a community that I know is very close to my grandfather, Zecher Tzadik Levracha's heart. It is an even more extraordinary privilege to be here with my friend, colleague, a former colleague, and my teacher, Rabbi David Zirkin. I cannot imagine a way in which the Riverdale community could be more fortunate than to have secured Rabbi Zirkin as the rabbi of the RJC and as a member of the illustrious rabbinic staff of the Riverdale community. Aside from being a superlative Talmid Chacham, as I know you all know, he's a man of incredible warmth and kindness. And Shlomit, my wife, and I have been so enormously grateful for his friendship and for Rebbetzin Zirkin's friendship over these many years. I'll share my screen with you in just a moment. But beforehand, I'd like to sort of introduce the topic by relating to you a vignette that occurred to me now over a decade ago that I think frames not only this evening's discussion in a useful way, but that also, I hope, will frame the series that I know your community is embarking upon, because it touches on two of the principal characters in the drama that's going to unfold for your community over the next couple of weeks. And that is when I was studying for my master's in London, I was fortunate enough to be asked by the community that year on Shavuos to speak for the community in one of the local shuls. And that year, as I recall, the London community had done something quite, I thought, brilliant, which was they wanted to give the community a sense of all of the Torah that was being studied and articulated over the course of that Shavuos. So they collected a master list of every single shiur that would be given in every single shul across the suburbs of London that Shavuos, that people would know, could decide where they wanted to go. And as happenstance would have it, when the gabbai of the shul where I was davening, prior to Shavuos, a Shabbos or two before Shavuos, was reading out the names of the shiurim that would take place in that local community within walking distance of the members over the course of the coming Shavuos. It happened to be that they read my name second to last, and they announced, Rabbi Lamm will be speaking about so and so forth over the course of Shavuos. The last name that they read was the late Chief Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs, who would be speaking about so on and so forth. Now, when they announced the names, they said Rabbi Lamm will be speaking about such and such, and Rabbi Sachs will be speaking about such and such. And at the time, I was quite a young man. No one knew who I was, which may still be the case, but nobody knew who I was. And I remember sitting in front of two people who, as these announcements were being read out, and as those two names were read out, one of them turned to the other and said, "Wow, Rabbi Lamm and Rabbi Sachs, how could you possibly choose between the two?" So I turned around to them and I said, "Chevra, I'm about to make your choice a lot easier." And that was that. So my without further ado, I'll share my screen with you. My grandfather was a man of prodigious talent, towering intellect, unparalleled warmth and kindness towards the vulnerable and really towards anyone who crossed his path. And there's no possible way to plumb the depths of his legacy in the course of a brief evening, let alone in a lifetime, let alone in a brief evening. What I'd like to do, therefore, is frame at least some element of his avodas Hashem, of his worship of the Almighty, in the context of his intellectual output, of his intellectual career, and his contributions in at least one small aspect of his contributions to the world of Torah, and I think to the way in which the world of Torah should contribute to the wider world around us. What I'd like to do, therefore, is frame my grandfather's career and his forays into the world of Chachma, Chachmas Torah, and Chachma in general, in the context of a particular moment in history. And what I have in mind is the launch of a space shuttle. About 50 years ago, 52 years ago, almost to the day. Some people on the call may even remember it happening. Some may have even watched it live. The Apollo 8 space shuttle was launched into space and became, and the crew of Apollo 8 became the first humans to orbit the moon. And the moment when this orbit occurred, and when this incredible leap forward in mankind's technological prowess and subdual of the forces of nature took place, was on Christmas Eve. And it was therefore just about 52 years ago this week, in December 24th, 1968, that this took place. And as it took place, the crew of Apollo 8 they wondered, how could they possibly mark an occasion of this magnitude when man took its first strides into the stratosphere? And they decided, in a moment of unusual insight, I think, to mark that occasion with the following words.
We are now approaching for all the people back on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. And God said, let there be light. And there was light. And God saw the light, that it was good. And God divided the light from the darkness.
These were the words that human beings across the world, that Americans across the country, heard on December 24th, 1968. As man took its first steps into the great beyond, it broadcast back to our fellow countrymen and our fellow human beings the very opening words of Sefer Bereshis, of the Torah, the words by which God brought all of existence into being. Now, when this occurred, it was just a couple of days short of my grandfather's 41st birthday. He was born on December 19th, 1927. And we'll see over the course of this evening, I hope, that actually all of his best drushos were delivered on his birthday. I don't think on purpose, but that seems to be how it was. But I want to situate my grandfather historically in this sense. My grandfather came into his prime just short of his 41st birthday, his absolute prime as an orator, as a teacher, as a theologian, as a Talmud Chacham, as a public thinker. As this occurred, this was the world into which the Rabbi Norman Lamm that our community and that all of society celebrated was born into this world, a world in which truly Hashamayim Mesaprim Kvod Ke'el U'Maseh Yadav Magid Harakia, in which it became clear that conviction that we, the Jewish people, had nurtured about the Torah for thousands of years, that its wisdom could truly inspire not just some small pocket of humanity, the Jewish people, but all of humanity. That was coming true before our very eyes. The wisdom of our forefathers was inspiring a country, inspiring a people. And my grandfather was born into that world, matured in that world. And so the great project of his life in quite nearly every respect was to grapple with an unprecedented opportunity in the history of Yahadus, which was we finally had the chance to articulate divine wisdom to a world that was actually willing to hear it. And some of that was as the Lubavitcher Rebbe taught in his own way, part of the divine providence of us, the Jewish people, finding our ways to the shores of this country, a country that was founded on the very values that we've cherished, the values of the Hebrew Bible. And some of it was just the Chazdei Hashem of living in a time of extraordinary spiritual enlightenment. But this was the world that my grandfather was born into. And so the problem, or rather the challenge of his career, was how to engage the world in a way that Jews had simply not been able to engage the world at any point in our prior history. And my grandfather's solution to that challenge, which I'd like to explore with you this evening, was threefold. My grandfather thought that if the Jewish people are going to engage the world, if we are going to be Mekadesh Shem Shemayim Barabim, if we truly are going to do our part, to perform our hishtadlus in the mission of Hashemayim Mesaprim Kavod Kel, Masei Yadav Magid Harakia, we needed three things. First of all, we needed a willingness to listen. And I'll tell you, my grandfather's willingness to listen to anyone was legendary. And I experienced, and I'll explain to all of you in a moment what I see as its most public articulation. But I'd also like to sort of let you underneath the hood of the car, as it were, to give you my own personal experience with my grandfather's extraordinary capacity to learn from others. When I was, growing up as a child, my grandfather was simply Zaida. He was my grandfather. I had no idea, nor did I care, that he was a public figure of some renown, because for me, he was simply a loving and a doting figure whose public life did not impinge on our relationship in any possible way, and he liked it that way, and he kept it that way. As I grew older, I became sort of aware of his role as a public figure. But again, it was one of those things that sort of, occurred in the background of my life. And it was only once I sort of entered into sort of the later years in high school and began to take him very seriously and began to mature in some way myself, as many young people do at that age, began to really appreciate everything that he was, that I almost had this sense of urgency, of emergency, because of course nobody lives forever, and I knew he wouldn't be around forever, and so I took it upon myself to study with him as much as I could, and so we embarked upon a chavrusa together. And in the beginning, it was I learned with him in private, and I also had a chabura with him, with myself, my cousin John Lamm, and my dear friend Menachem Butler. The three of us actually learned together, and my grandfather insisted on learning with us hakdamos to svarim. We learned the introductions to various svarim, because as my grandfather believed, all of the good hashkafa is always found in the introduction to a sefer. Now, of all the wide world of Torah literature that was open to us, we could have learned anything. We could have learned the introduction to Nefesh HaChaim. Rav Chaim Volozhiner was a zero. We could have learned the introduction to any number of Hasidic svarim. My grandfather was a connoisseur of Hasidic thought and was enamored of Hasidic teaching. We could have learned the introduction to the Ramban. We could have learned the introduction to the Chasam Sofer, the Igros Moshe, all things we did learn, by the way. But the very first sefer that my grandfather insisted that we study the introduction to was Vayel Moshe, was the magnum opus of the Satmar Rebbe, and the doyen of anti-Zionist thought within the modern Jewish context. And what was quite extraordinary, and I still have the photocopies that he provided to us of the Vayel Moshe with my notes on them. And I remember thinking, I jotted this down on my notes at the time. I remember thinking it was so extraordinary because we're reading through the Akdama, And the Satmar Rebbe is excoriating Jews who betrayed their values by involving themselves with the Tzionim and by being open to the repulsive thought of the Goyim and so on and so forth. And I remember thinking to myself that this could not have possibly been lost on my grandfather, that so much of what the Satmar Rebbe was describing in those opening paragraphs of the Vayal Moshe was my grandfather. My grandfather, in many respects, was the villain of Vayal Moshe. And I remember thinking, and my grandfather never remarked upon this. We simply took this text very seriously. We studied it. We pored over it for weeks and weeks. We pored over it. And never once did he remark upon how strange it was that we were learning a text that in many ways he thought was deeply and radically wrong. And as I had time to reflect upon this in preparing this shir, preparing this talk, I turned to my library, which is sort of on either side of me here, and I just took off the shelf. I took off the shelf my grandfather's copy of Nefesh HaChaim, which I have, and I was flipping through some of the pages that he had marked down, and every now and then these days when I think about my grandfather, I like to go through his Sfarim because that's the easiest way to still talk to him now that we've lost him. And I came upon the following page that he had bookmarked. This is from his copy of Vayal Moshe, of Nefesh HaChaim by Rav Chaim Volozhiner. The piece here that you can see that he tagged was a story of Rav Chaim Volozhin, which was apparently there was a fellow whom the Nefesh HaChaim, who's described in sort of these collections of stories at the end of the Nefesh HaChaim about Rav Chaim Volozhiner, who's described as a balabas, which as any Talmud Chacham know is about the most abrasive insult you can hurl at somebody. There's a balabas in the community of Rav Chaim who would claim to have studied all of Shas, but it was clear that he had studied Shas in a way that wasn't quite respectable in the eyes of the toweringly accomplished Talmidei Chachamim of the Volozhin Yeshiva. They didn't have a lot of respect for this balabas's bekiyas. And nevertheless, every time this balabas walked into a room, Rav Chaim Volozhiner would stand up. And when his students asked him why he would stand up for a balabas who was simply parading, who was masquerading as a Talmid Chacham, but wasn't the real Talmid Chacham, Rav Chaim explained that he said, "Listen, there are two printings of the Talmud, and nowadays we use the Vilna Shas, and some version, or many of us, some version of the Masifta or the Ozvahadar or the Art Scroll or the Koran or the Shansi, what have you. But back then there were two printings. There was the Amsterdam printing, which was a very high quality printing and was the one that was standard apparently in the Yeshiva of Volozhin. That was the Shas that they studied out of, the Amsterdam, and had the Rashi and the Tosas on either side, as we're used to. But then there was a very low quality printing that was done in the 17th century, the Sulzbach printing. The Sulzbach printing was a very low quality printing. It had a lot of mistakes in it, and it was known to the Talmidei Chachamim as the real Talmidei Chachamim as of a deeply inferior quality. Rav Chaim Volozhin said there are some Talmidei Chachamim who are in Amsterdam Shas. They know everything; it's perfect, it's reliable. But there are some people who are Talmidei Chachamim who are Sulzbach Shases. They have some mistakes and they don't do it perfectly. But even just because something isn't perfect, it doesn't mean it doesn't have Kedushas Hashas. And so I stand for this balabas. And and this story really spoke to my grandfather. It was one of the things that he tagged in his copy of Nefesh HaChaim. And I often thought that this was part of my grandfather's genius. It wasn't just that he was Kabbalas Emes Mishamar, or he would accept the truth from anybody who would listen. He was very conscious of the fact that many of the people who are worth studying are flawed. They're Sulzbach Shases. And of course, I don't mean, of course, to impute this description to the Satmar Rebbe, who was certainly one of the prodigious Talmidei Chachamim of our time. But my grandfather, in many ways, considered him a very flawed thinker, and nevertheless was willing to learn from him. And in an era, and I think this is critical, in an era in which the Jewish people are called upon to respond to the great problems of the day, in which even astronauts who are blasting off into space are open to our wisdom. We actually have a responsibility to listen to the world around us, to learn from the entire world around us. In a time when we have an unprecedented opportunity to impact the world, our first responsibility is to listen. And this actually played out, I think, quite famously in my grandfather's best known accomplishment in his later years, which was to popularize the philosophy, or rather the pedagogy of Torah Umada. For my grandfather, Torah Umada was in many respects the ultimate expression of his insistence that the Jewish people have a responsibility to listen to the world around us and to be honest enough to listen to the world around us. And the truth is, the best way I can express this conviction on the part of my grandfather is not to express it at all, but rather to let him express it for himself.
Sacred goal was to achieve shlemus. The broader my intellectual horizons, the higher is my spiritual reach and the deeper is my religious commitment. The more comprehensive and inclusive the domain I conceive to be that of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the closer do I approach that ever-receding asymptotic ideal of shlemus. This is shlemus with a wide-angle lens instead of a zoom lens. And this indeed is a hint of what Torah Umada can mean to us if it is structured on the basic Hasidic ideal of avodah begashmias. Grasping a differential equation or a concept in quantum mechanics can let us perceive and reveal a locus in the abstract governance of the universe. An insight into molecular biology or depth psychology or the dynamics of society can inspire us with a fascination with God's creation, a fascination which the Rambam identifies as Avas Hashem. A new appreciation of a Beethoven symphony or a Cézanne painting or the poetry of a Milton can move us to greater sensitivity to the infinite possibilities of the creative imagination with which the Creator endowed his Tzelem Elokim.
And so
I summarize.
And so I think that you can easily see here that my grandfather's understanding of Torah Umada in many respects was informed by an insistence that the Jewish people must, in some respects, as Avdei Hashem and as imitators of God, must adopt a perspective of humility, of a willingness to hear, a willingness to listen, and to the extent that the world around us has so much to teach, imperfect as it is, Zoltzbach Shas as it may be, there's still so much that we have to gain from the world around us. And Torah Umada, I think, in many respects, was the highest expression of that. However, aval. Now, I use the term aval here with some degree of irony because, as my grandfather once said in a sermon of his, the word "but" as a moral loophole has no business in the language of Jewish life. However, but it is here that I think it is appropriate to correct what I think is a misapprehension of my grandfather's thought that I encounter often enough that I think the gauntlet needs to be thrown down. And in many respects, this interpretation of my grandfather is a great injustice to his legacy. And that is, I often hear Torah Umada as a slogan, which and as far as it represented a slogan, it was something he detested. I often hear Torah Umada bandied about in a sloganeering way, as if it is some matir, some permission that we have to venture out into the world and not take our spiritual surroundings as seriously as other of our spiritual brethren in the traditional Jewish community, as if in some way the Torah Umada legitimates the secular approach to life or the secular world. And in fact, my grandfather not only disagreed with that, but he said so loudly and proudly in Torah Umada itself. Here's a passage that is, as you can see in my copy, I actually had underlined long before this year. But as my grandfather wrote in Torah Umada, this is not merely a dispensation for Torah Umada, it is a divine imperative, a charge to seek inspiration in the broadest realms of the intellect and imagination. My grandfather thought that Torah Umada was a tzivoy, it was not a matir, it was an obligation, it was not a dispensation. And more importantly, my grandfather contrasted Torah Umada and the worldview that it entails with secularism. He thought secularism in the secular world was the antithesis of Torah Umada. As my grandfather said, just as that Torah Umada was the very opposite notion from contemporary secularism, which is antagonistic to the encroachment by the sacred on the public domain and seeks to restrict the sacred. For my grandfather, Torah Umada was as much a project of war upon the secular world as it was a project of rapprochement with it. It was as much a rebuke to the world around us, to the secular world around us, as it was an appreciation of it. And the reason for this, after all, is because my grandfather understood Torah Umada in a very particular way. Now, for those of you who've read the book Torah Umada, and those of you who haven't, I highly recommend it. My grandfather doesn't articulate in the book a vision of Torah Umada or the vision of Torah Umada. He actually lays out a series of different models upon which Torah Umada could be built. There's the Hirschian model, there's the Torah Derech Eretz model, there's the Hasidic model, there's the Rav Kook model, there's the Maimonidean model, there's the Rambam's model. But of all the model that he lays out, he actually claims explicitly in the book to prefer one of them. And that was the Hasidic model. And for my grandfather, the Hasidic model and his preferred model of Torah Umada was built on the concept of avoda b'gashmios, of serving God through the mundane and through the physical. The Hasidim developed with great sophistication the notion that man can serve God in full fashion, in what the Zidachaver referred to as avoda tama, as perfect avoda of Hashem, through one's mundane activities. A cobbler can serve God through repairing shoes. A woodcutter can serve God through chopping God. There are ways to sanctify one's experience. But the only way that avoda b'gashmios, and from this, by the way, from serving God through the physical, my grandfather extrapolated that God can also be served through the intellectual, as much through a Beethoven symphony or through a Cézanne painting, as through woodcutting or cobbling shoes, as much through breaking down the structure of a carbohydrate as by consuming food. And for my grandfather, therefore, avoda b'gashmios was not in any way sort of permission to engage the world in a less serious way than somebody who doesn't believe in avoda b'gashmios, or somebody who thinks avoda b'gashmios is somehow lesser than some other form of serving God. But rather, avoda b'gashmios imposes deep and difficult responsibilities upon the person engaging in it. And so for my grandfather, therefore, he believed that when one is involved, as he says here, when one is involved in any worldly matter, he has it in his power by virtue of his thoughts and intentions to liberate those sparks, the sparks of the divine creation, returning them to their divine source. This act of the redemption or elevation of the divine sparks is in and of itself an act of the greatest religious significance, not merely an instrument for some later fulfillment. And so while my grandfather certainly thought that Torah Umada was pointed to the Jewish obligation to learn from our surroundings, my grandfather, in fact, devoted far more, I would argue, of his intellectual output and his spiritual career to arguing for another postulate of Jewish life that I think was in many ways much more deeply shaped by the world of Apollo 8, and that is our obligation to teach. My grandfather believed that in a world that was so unusually and unprecedentedly receptive to the wisdom that our people uniquely steward and are able to teach, we have an obligation to teach the world around us. Now, first of all, why do we have an obligation to teach? Now, I should note at the outset that before I explain my grandfather's philosophy of the Jewish people's obligation to teach, I should say that my grandfather himself was an extraordinary teacher. And not just an extraordinary teacher, he was a kind and constructive teacher. He was a sharp teacher, but a kind and constructive teacher. And I'll just relate one quick anecdote that relates to my time at the Jewish Center, to which Rabbi Zirkin alluded to before. Rabbi Zirkin actually is directly implicated in this story, because the first Shabbos that I was given permission by Rabbi Zirkin and Rabbi Yas Levine of the Jewish Center, to give a drasha in front of the main shul, in front of the main sanctuary at the Jewish Center. I prepared a drasha, I prepared a sermon, and I was quite confident at the time that I was going to knock people's socks off and blow people away, and I was really going to hit a home run. And that morning, Shabbos morning, I walked with my grandfather to shul. And my grandfather at the time was already physically ailing, and so the walk, from Central Park West and 88th to the Jewish Center on 86th between Columbus and Amsterdam was nevertheless quite a trek. And so we had some time. So as we're walking down 87th Street, my grandfather turns to me and he says, "So, Newt, what are you going to talk about this morning?" So I told him. And I gave him the whole thing, and I was expecting at the end tears to come streaming down his face at the pride that he felt at the legacy that I would be carrying on. And I'll never forget as long as I live. We get to the corner of Columbus and Amsterdam, and my grandfather stops walking. He's a walker. He stops walking, and and we didn't have time to get to shul. We didn't have time for a stop and chat. My grandfather turns to me and he says, "That is terrible. You can't give that. You can't give a drasha like that in front of the Jewish Center. It's the Jewish Center. It's the main sanctuary. If they have a good drasha, you can't give that drasha." And I was panicking. I was torn to pieces. But because my grandfather was a sharp teacher, but an incredibly kind one, so he said to me, "Don't worry, we can fix this." He said, "What's your main idea?" So I gave him what I thought my main idea was. He said, he was so disorganized. "Give me your main idea." I gave him what I thought my main idea was, and he said, "Okay, there's something to work with there. That's not bad." And he said, what's your best turn of phrase that you have?" So I gave him, I racked my brains, and I at that time I wasn't paying sufficient attention to the artistry of drush as to the poetry of drush as he would have called it. But I gave him what I thought was my best turn of phrase, and he said, "Okay, not great, but not terrible. We can work with that." He suggested then several ways to reorganize it. He suggested 3 turns of phrase that I could use that would be elegant enough to do respect to the parsha that I was darshaning. And then he said, "Listen, all you have to do is remember this, put this here, put that there, say this here, say that there. As long as you can remember that, you'll be fine." I don't remember saying a word of Shacharis that morning, and I don't remember a single word of Kriyas HaTorah. I was so panicky. I don't even remember what I said. All I remember is the feeling of coming down from the bima and my grandfather standing there and coming up to me. And when I returned to my seat, I sat next to him. And I remember him squeezing my hand and saying, "You did great." And that was the kind of teacher that my grandfather was. I don't know if I did great, but he said I did great because that was the kind of teacher that he was. So he certainly believed that the Jewish people writ large have an obligation to teach. So what do we have an obligation? So why do we have an obligation to teach? My grandfather believed we have an obligation to teach fundamentally because of who we are as a people. In a sermon from 1964 in Parshas Korach called "Rebel or Revolutionary," my grandfather took to task the conventional wisdom about Korach va'adaso, about Korach and his gang of unruly rebels, that somehow rebellion or revolution is antithetical to the spirit of Judaism. My grandfather thought that was absolute nonsense. My grandfather, in fact, wrote, so my grandfather thought, of course, that there was a type of rebellion, a form of merida, a form of rebellion that was certainly inimical to a Torah personality. However, my grandfather wrote, what is the prophetic tradition, if not the expression of a revolutionary character? What was wrong with Korach, of course, was that he didn't rebel in the right way. He didn't rebel in a kosher way. But the prophetic tradition had its genesis in Abraham, who was an iconoclast. It reached its heights in Moses, who defied Pharaoh and both the military might and cultural hegemony of Egypt. Elijah was a revolutionary when he challenged Ahab, and Isaiah when he thundered against the drunkards who ruled the northern kingdom of Israel, and Ezekiel when he dissented from the popular worship of Bel and Marduk. For 3,500 years, Judaism has been out of step with the world and has thus managed to be its repository of sanity and sanctity. A quote that, of course, has its echoes in the famous words of John Adams, our second president, when he described the Jewish people. The Jewish people have given religion to 3/4 of the globe and have influenced the affairs of mankind more and more happily than any other people, ancient or modern. We, the Jewish people, have always been the teachers of mankind, whether they have liked it or not, and more often than not, they have not liked it. And nevertheless, we have an obligation to teach because of our forefathers. It is our Masorah to be countercultural. And it's for this reason, in fact, that my grandfather had a great deal of sympathy for hippie culture. In fact, I often tell people that my grandfather did a lot of brave things in his life. He disinvited Henry Kissinger from being a guest of honor at the Yeshiva University Hanukkah dinner to the outrage of Henry Kissinger. He defied this person, that person. He had, he did a lot of difficult things in his life. I think the bravest thing he ever did was as the rabbi of a traditionally German congregation in the heart of Manhattan, that on no less than 3 occasions, my grandfather delivered drushas defending the hippies. So in any event, my grandfather thought that the Jewish people, as much as he thought the hippies were drug-addled, perpetual adolescents, he nevertheless thought that there was some admirable yearning at the heart of what they were doing. He thought they were just going about it the wrong way, in a terribly wrong way. And I'll come back to that actually in a moment. But my grandfather thought we had an obligation to teach because we're a countercultural people. Now, what do we have an obligation to teach? This was the second piece of my grandfather's wisdom. And here I think my grandfather, his entire career embodied a refutation of that terrible conviction that we so often hear it uttered within the Jewish community writ large, but especially within what we might call, for lack of a better term, the modern Orthodox community, that terrible conviction, which is that rabbis should not talk politics. And my grandfather detested this form of thinking with every fiber of his being, not because he believed that rabbis should be partisan, but he certainly believed that they should be political. Why? Well, as my grandfather wrote in a drasha, also just around his birthday, December 6, 1952. And my grandfather, you should understand the words we're about to read, my grandfather wrote when he was 24 years old, just shy of his 25th birthday, in a sermon called Jacob's Peace Treaty. This was in 1953. This was offered on the eve of the peace talks for the Korean War. And my grandfather took up the question, as you can see here, of what the United States should do. Should we make peace with the communists, and in so doing, exchange back to them terrible criminals of war, and capitulate to the communists in unsavory ways? Or, even though we are weary and tired of war as a people, should we hold out for a just resolution to the war? So, in other words, my grandfather was contemplating, as he put it, the question of should we come down on the side of peace, or should we come down on the side of truth? Shalom or emes? Now, a 24-year-old Rabbi Norman Lamm said the following things to his congregation. It is not the business of a rabbi to comment on purely political or diplomatic matters, but when matters of principle are involved, then the people have the right to know what the teachers of religion have to say about the burning issues of our time. And this is one of my favorite lines that he ever wrote. When the propaganda machines have ceased their loud clattering and the din of the partisan shouting has been silenced, the still small voice of religion must make known its moral and spiritual judgment. There cannot be any serious realm of our lives that is sequestered from the judgment of religion. And it cannot be that rabbis, if they're taking their jobs seriously, should restrict themselves to commenting only on those things that we care sufficiently little about, that we don't mind if the rabbis talk about them. My grandfather felt this with every fiber of his being. Now, you may think, well, it's one thing to say we're going to talk about politics, but surely Rabbi Lamm didn't have a position. We don't want rabbis taking a position on anything. They can lay out the issues, but that's one thing. Not so. My grandfather comes to a conclusion about what the United States should do in the Korean War talks. The drasha was based on that week's parsha when it talks about Yaakov confronting Esav, and the pasuk there tells us that Vayikach min haba biyado mincha le'esav. That Yaakov, when he was preparing to meet Esav, gave a gift, prepared to give a gift to Esav. Now, what sort of gift did he give? Rashi there says, haba biyado min achulin. That Yaakov was prepared to give Esav any unsanctified gift that he could possibly desire. However, as my grandfather pointed out, Rashi's implication is that one thing that Yaakov was not willing to surrender was haba biyado min hakadshim. He's not willing to surrender any of his most sacred principles. So that, my friends, my grandfather spoke at the time. Jacob's peace treaty is certainly a great lesson for our times. If peace conflicts with truth, peace must go and truth must prevail. Such is the moral decision of Judaism, and it is a decision binding upon all descendants of Jacob. And therefore, if today the free world is faced by this conflict, Korean truce versus forced repatriation, peace versus truth and justice, it is the principle of truth and justice which must win. We American Jews can feel happy and secure in the knowledge, which at the time was merely a hope, that the position taken by our government on this crucial and tragic issue is in the best traditions of Jacobean Judaism. My grandfather had a position on the Korean war talks, and he thought it was important that he, as a man of the cloth, as a master of, or at least as at that time as a young man, as at least an aspiring Eved Hashem and a link in the chain of the Masorah, that he should have something to say about it. Now, how do we teach? And this was also crucial to my grandfather. I often see now, whether it's rabbis or Jewish public thinkers who seek to enter into the arena of ideas by engaging, as they should, all the burning questions of the day. And my grandfather certainly felt that we should engage all the burning questions of the day. But today, one of the things that irks me often is sometimes the willingness or even the eagerness of Jewish public thinkers, oftentimes not traditional Jewish thinkers, but sometimes even Orthodox Jewish thinkers. I'm often disturbed by the willingness of those around us to simply adopt the slogans or the language of the world around us. And I think often of the fault that the prophet Samuel, that Shmuel HaNavi finds in the Jewish people when they ask for a king. You may wonder, of course, as many of the Mefarshim did, as all the Mefarshim did, how could Shmuel HaNavi fault the Jewish people at the beginning of the Iron Age, in the time of what would become the tenure of Shaul HaMelech? How could Shmuel fault the Jewish people for asking for a king? And he excoriates the Jewish people. How could he fault them? After all, hadn't God in Dvarim, through Moshe Rabbeinu simply prescribed the regulations by which the Jewish people could appoint a king? How could Shmuel HaNavi be upset at the Jewish people for simply following a prerogative that was granted to them by the Almighty in the book of Deuteronomy? The answer, the traditional answer, is that the problem with the Jewish people's request in Sefer Shmuel, all those years after Sefer Devarim had been delivered, was not that they asked for a king, but that they asked for a king kechol hagoyim misaviv. They asked for a king like all the Gentiles round about, like all the nations round about. The problem with the Jews is not that they participate in, the problem that Jews have is not that they participate in society. The problem comes when they participate in society on society's terms. My grandfather felt very strongly that if we are to engage the public square, as we must, in a world where the words of Genesis emanate from the very moon itself, we have an obligation to participate in the public square. We have an opportunity to participate in the public square, but we must do so as Jews using our own authentic concepts. And nowhere, on no issue, on no public issue, was this more apparent than in my grandfather's commentary on matters of racial justice. And here my grandfather spoke very, very often. And one of this was an issue with which my grandfather was veritably obsessed, which was the issue of civil rights. My grandfather was one of the prominent Jewish thinkers who was very vocally supportive of the civil rights movement, of Martin Luther King Jr. And one of my grandfather's signal contributions to Jewish thought on these matters was precisely, however, that he did not simply support civil rights, qua civil rights. He supported civil rights in a way that he felt was Jewishly literate And in so doing, my grandfather, and this should be the subject of a separate shir, my grandfather developed an extraordinary and unusual approach to racism, or to combating racism, that was rooted in his sense that the crime of racism was the crime of avodah zarah. This deserves unpacking in its own right, which we don't have time to do so here, but I'll give you just a brief overview of his thought in this matter from this particular sermon, which was actually delivered the very Shabbos after the March on Washington. This was from August 31st, 1963. It was called The Religious Foundation of Business. And in it, my grandfather noted on that week's Parsha that the Rebbe Levi's comment in the Gemara in Bava Basra and Peiches Amud Beis, that kasha onshan shel midos yoser me onshan shel arayos, that having false weights and measures is a worse crime than immorality, than sexual immorality. How could that be? My grandfather referred to an insight of the Netziv, who articulated the following theory, that actually all crimes in Judaism are reducible to three types. There are crimes of passion, there are crimes of hatred, and there are crimes of unfaithfulness, of lack of faith. And the extremes of those three crimes are typified in the three cardinal sins for which one must surrender their life rather than transgress. Gilei Arayos, crimes of passion, Shvichos Damim, crimes of hatred, and Avodah Zarah, crimes of lack of faith. As the Netziv points out, and as my grandfather elaborates, the crime of Avodah Zarah, in the Netziv's thought, was actually the worst of those three crimes. Crimes that bespeak a lack of faith are the worst crimes. Why? Because they are the only crimes that actually require a worldview to sustain. So Gilei Arayos, in the heat of the moment, to sin with another person on a matter of sexual immorality doesn't require a worldview. It simply requires an appetite. To kill somebody in a moment of hatred doesn't require a worldview. It simply requires momentary insanity, a momentary blindness to the divine image implanted in each of us. But a crime of Avodah Zarah, it's extremely difficult to imagine a realistic scenario under which a single individual transgresses the crime of Avodah Zarah. It's halachically possible, but realistically, Avodah Zarah occurs when an entire society has become sick, when an entire society has abandoned any notion of spiritual realism and has deluded itself that either it itself is a god or that some inanimate object is a god. And therefore, the crime of midos and mishkalos, of having false weights and measures, is fundamentally, my grandfather argued, a crime of avodah zarah. Because if you're the type of person who keeps false weights and measures in your store, then you are the kind of person who is living in a society that aids and abets crime and fraud and disadvantaging your fellow human being. And my grandfather thought, therefore, that racism actually was just such a crime. So as he wrote, the crux of the issue is not so much freedom now for Black Americans, of course, this was the term that was in use at the time, as self-respect and dignity now for the white majority, which allowed such disgraceful discrimination to continue unabated for 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. It was bad enough when hate-frenzied mobs lynched individual Black people, but this crime of shvichas damim, homicide, is exceeded by the greater blot on our record, the methodical economic exploitation of one segment of our population, the systematic oppression of one race as the source of cheap labor and its designation as the first to suffer in any economic recession. These are my underlines. When the economy of a great nation is built upon such patent injustice, it is a crime of avodah zarah. It is a breach of faith. And any time that my grandfather ever spoke about the crime of racism, he consistently, no matter the context, referred to it as avodah zarah. Now, you may be thinking to yourself that what my grandfather describes here is something that in the contemporary parlance you might think of as systemic racism, which is a very popular term amongst activists in our own day. But notice that my grandfather insists on using, now he didn't know that term, but my grandfather insists on calling out a terrible social crime, not in terms that would have been popular or familiar in the day. He insisted on using our own language. And the reason that he did that, as he articulated in so many contexts, is because although it is true that oftentimes the world around us, the society around us, want all people, including us, to adopt whatever language is fashionable or is useful at the time to those in power. The Jewish people simply don't have the option to do that, because we have a greater responsibility to HaKadosh Baruch Hu to spread his values across all of society. And therefore, if we are going to engage on the issues of the day, we must do so not as allies of some other cause, but as champions of our own cause. And if our own cause allies us with others in society, so be it. And if the language that we use, which is the language of the Torah, makes us uncomfortable around people who are our allies, and so be that as well, because that is a manifestation of the Jewish people's obligation to teach. We must be countercultural. We must be willing to call out injustice when we see it. But when we call out injustice, and when we teach, not just injustice, when we teach the world values, when we engage on matters of import to the wider society, we must do so as Jews. And that brings me to what I think is the third pillar of my grandfather's approach to engaging the world. And that is that at all times, the Jews must engage the world from the standpoint of Jewish dignity and self-respect. We cannot grovel before those with whom we seek to engage. The best way that I think that you can see this is from a sermon, again, delivered just a couple of days before his birthday, this time his 42nd birthday, December 13th, 1969, called Three Tables. And in it, my grandfather discusses Yosef, whose background and identity and story he mines for insight into what he describes as the Gullus Jew, as the Jew who is caught in the pincers of assimilation. And as my grandfather says in the essay, he doesn't mean by exploring this theme, God forbid, chas v'shalom, to impugn the saintliness of Yosef, but he wanted to use the story of Yosef to explain something that he found very troubling about Jewish thinkers and leaders at the time. Now, bear in mind, when my grandfather gave this sermon, it was just a couple of years after Vatican II. It's just a couple of years after the Catholic Church had, thankfully, renounced some of its anti-Semitic positions vis-a-vis the Jews, or at least modified them and said some very lovely things. But one of the unfortunate byproducts of Vatican II was a rise in a certain form of odious interfaith dialogue. My grandfather was regularly in conversation with thinkers of other faiths, and he cherished those conversations, but he had nothing but disgust for the type of interfaith dialogue, which proceeded on the presumption that Jews should somehow be willing to haggle away our doctrinal commitments in the interest of friendship with people who have newly discovered that they want to be our friends. If we're going to engage with other communities, as my grandfather's thought, not only we could, but we absolutely must. We must do so from the perspective of the unique tradition that Judaism occupied, the unique space and tradition that Judaism occupies and maintains. And that brings me to the wonderful sentences that my grandfather wrote in this drasha in 1969. My grandfather had nothing but scorn for the type of Jew whose highest ambition was simply to be accepted by the society around us, and would compromise on his or her identity, learning, tradition, in order to find acceptance amongst those whose approval they craved. The successful assimilationist is, after all, a pitiful failure. He has power and money and influence, and the guy won't have him. He will no more accept him than the Jew who shakes while he prays, or reads the Yiddish paper, or eats special kosher foods, or sends his child to a yeshiva. The Joseph Jew succeeds in everything except that he cannot become a wasp, and that he regards as the tragedy of his life. So the guy will do business with him, play politics with him, even conduct a dialogue with him, but he won't let him into his private clubs, even if he, the Jew, married out of his faith. And if he does allow him into his club, he will not really invite him into his home and let him share his table. This was a pillar of my grandfather's engagement with the wider world. And it manifested, in fact, in that very issue, the fight against racism, about which my grandfather was so deeply passionate. In fact, in a sermon that my grandfather gave in 1970, it's one of my favorite sermons of his, and with this we'll conclude. It's called Confessions of a Confused Rabbi. It is, I think, to the best of my knowledge, the only sermon that my grandfather ever delivered that wasn't really a drasha at all. It was a methodological manifesto. It was a sermon in which he explained how he gives sermons, and it was prompted by the Kent State shootings, when student activists had been killed. And that Shabbos, when the shootings occurred, my grandfather gave a drasha, a wonderful drasha, about the Jewish view of ecology, and didn't engage, which I highly encourage you to read, and didn't engage with the issue at all. And my grandfather noted the following Shabbos that in the intervening week, students, young people in the community had come up to him and had harangued him for not speaking about the Kent State shootings. Rabbi, how could you possibly not address something so important? And my grandfather begins the drasha with the following comment. Apologies. In a sense, I admit that this particular form of criticism was welcome, since it offset the sometimes disgruntled reactions that come from my occasional foray into public issues. So those of you who are rabbis out there who have ever been criticized for addressing politics, you should not be under the impression that somehow Rabbi Lamm was immune from such criticism. He got it also. He just didn't let it stop him. But my grandfather actually gave an entire sermon in which he endeavored to explain why it was that he didn't address the Kent State shootings. And he offered several reasons for which he was too confused, as he put it, to offer a perspective on the matter that he was confident standing by. One of the reasons that he offered for not addressing the shootings was that he felt very strongly that while the spiritual yearnings that pushed the student activists of the time to protest on campuses were admirable, while he saw that while he felt very strongly that the establishment against which youth culture was rebelling was morally empty and grotesque, he also was made extremely uncomfortable, even angry, even outraged by the way in which the student activists of the day treated Jews. As he wrote, "Third, I question the priorities and consistency of many Jewish students when they make of the Black Panthers, Black nationalists, a great cause célèbre of their moralistic movement. Yes, I agree that they are in this country entitled to a fair trial and to be protected from police brutality and vindictiveness. I believe we should see to it that the police who were brutal are punished and that even Black Panthers receive their rights as American citizens. But they are not our friends. They are anti-Semites and they are anti-Israel. I would like to see young Jews who seek justice for the Black Panthers, and more power to them in their passion for justice, oppose these pernicious anti-Semites with equal zeal." And I believe that this position of my grandfather's has many parallels in our own time. There are those with whose cause we may be sympathetic, but who express deeply anti-Israel and sometimes anti-Semitic views, and we should have enough dignity and self-respect as Jews to call those things out and not make common cause with people who don't like us. My grandfather felt very strongly that the Jewish people have an obligation to teach, but we do not have an obligation to, we have an obligation to listen, an obligation to teach, but we do not have an obligation to grovel. And if the Jewish people are going to be effective teachers in the world in which we live, a world that is so open and that is so receptive to the wisdom that we have always been charged with teaching, we can only do so as proud Jews who are not willing to compromise on our identity. Now, to close, I mentioned at the beginning of this talk that my grandfather's career, that my grandfather's prime began with the launch of a space shuttle. And in many ways, his prime also came to an end with another launch of a space shuttle. And that was the shuttle that launched in the early 2000s. Some of you may remember the man in this picture. This is astronaut Ilan Ramone, the foremost Israeli astronaut to enter space. And you will recall that that upon his re-entry into the atmosphere, he was killed. Ilan Ramone was a secular Jew, a Chiloni Israeli, who nonetheless was deeply proud of his roots and his traditions. And in fact, he brought with him into space the Torah, a Torah that had been used in Bergen-Belsen brought with him a Torah into space. He kept kosher in space as he often advertised. And when Ilan Ramone was killed, my grandfather led a memorial service in 2003 at Yeshiva University, during which he said the following. Like Moses, who went up to receive the Torah and bring it down to the people of Israel, so too Ilan Ramone went up, bringing the Torah of Moses to display to his people on earth. My grandfather's prime began with the hint that the words of Torah could be brought up into the highest heights of the heavens. But the people who brought it up there were not Jewish. They brought up our wisdom, but it was not we who brought it up. That signaled to my grandfather that we had a great potential to impact the world around us. And my grandfather ended the prime of his career, having seen that possibility advanced. For by 2003, it was a Jew who brought the words of Torah, who brought those opening verses, those opening pasukim of the book of Genesis into space. And I think that journey from Apollo 8 to Ilan Ramone so encapsulates the charge that my grandfather leaves us as he departed this world. Now, you know, when my grandfather passed away, he was not himself. So much of who he was, his ability to speak, his ability to learn Torah, had been taken away from him. This 2003 should not have been the end of my grandfather's prime. And when he died, my grandfather did not die with any magnificent oration emerging from his lips, as Moshe Rabbeinu did. He didn't die with the words of the Shema Yisrael on his lips, as Rabbi Akiva did. But what he left us was his Torah. And like those great predecessors of his, he left us a legacy that was so much greater than any words he could have uttered in his dying moments. And we as his students have a responsibility to carry that legacy on. And that legacy charges us to listen to the world around us, whether it be listening to the call of nature, whether it be listening to the beauty of thinkers the world over, whether they be Amsterdam Shasses or Zolzbach Shasses, whether it be listening to the cry of the oppressed, of the vulnerable in society whose perspectives we need to understand. But we also have an obligation to teach our values, as we have been doing in this country since the days of our founding fathers. We have an obligation to be countercultural, to be the repository of Western sanity and sanctity. We have an obligation to teach using the indigenous concepts of our tradition, of our Masorah, when we have an obligation to teach in ways that preserve our dignity and self-respect. We have an obligation, in short, to teach as Jews. And if we can do these things, if we can listen, if we can teach, and if we can do so with dignity, then we can be the dying words on my grandfather's lips, the prayer, the tefillah that he would have wanted to offer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu as he shuffled off this mortal coil. And like Moses, like even Ilan Ramone, as he ventured back up Har Sinai on Shavuos, the day upon which he died, bringing the Torah with him, but leaving an entire legacy of Torah back on earth for us to carry on. And with that, I leave you. And if I don't know if we have time for questions, but certainly if we do, I'm happy to take any. And I defer in this respect to the wisdom of Rabbi Zirkin.
The hour is late. First and foremost, thank you to Rabbi Dr. Ari Lamm for this incredible presentation. And we're so thrilled you are all with us. Before they leave, I want to acknowledge the presence of family and friends and so many who are joining us virtually from near and far. In particular, I see through the Zoom boxes, a special welcome to President Richard and Esther Joel that are here with us virtually, as well as Rabbi Shalom Karmi and our Rebbe and teacher here in Riverdale, Rabbi Mordechai Willig. We're so glad that you all took the time to join us. Because the hour is late, I'm going to condense two questions into one, Rabbi Lamm, if that's okay. You mentioned your grandfather's opinions that were sometimes expressed about cultural trends during the day. and of course, much of his theology. So the two questions that I want to combine are about the people that he met in his lifetime and how he spoke about them. Were there secular artists that he was interested in, that he liked and valued, that he knew? And what about his relationships with the other Gedolim of the time? Did he share anything about those experiences with you that you can recall offhand?
Sure. It's a great question. So I'll tell you a story, actually, when it comes to secular artists. So if by that you mean pop culture, I was deputized as the interviews editor for Kol Mavasar, which was the Jewish thought magazine of the student body Yeshiva University when I was a student there. And my job was to interview the Rosh Yeshiva on matters of import to the student body and to the wider community. And we were going to do an issue on pop culture and Judaism. And I was asked to do an interview with one of the Rosh Yeshiva on the value of pop culture. And I decided that I was saving my grandfather for a really good topic. So I decided that was going to be the topic that I would go to my grandfather for. So I went to him and I sat down with him and I said, Zaida, I'd love to do an interview with you. And he said, what's the topic? And I said, what is the value of pop culture in Judaism? And he said, it'll be a very short interview. There isn't one. And my grandfather was not a fan of pop culture, although I will tell you that I know he watched MASH religiously. So that was one piece of pop culture that I know he consumed. And the other was I recently published an article in New York Post. And when I did, of which under its current stewardship by Sohrab Amari, who's the editor of the op-ed page, who's a wonderful friend of the Jewish people and a very interesting thinker, I think it's become a wonderful paper. But when I published it, people were joking with me, like, would your grandfather have published something in the New York Post? And on our family WhatsApp group, my aunts and uncles, not knowing that I was getting this kind of response, reminded the family that my grandfather, as an FDR Jew, couldn't bring himself to subscribe to the New York Post, but he would pick up a copy every day. So that was another piece of pop culture that my grandfather enjoyed consuming. When it came to Gedolim, so my grandfather had a deep and wonderful and very close relationship with many of the greats of our time. With some of whom he disagreed quite strongly on many matters. I actually have it upstairs in my study, a handwritten note from Rav Gifter to the Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshiva University, and my Rabbi Gifter had said some quite nasty things about my grandfather that turned out to be based on misinformation anyway, because his words had been misreported in the Jewish papers. And in fact, I have a file upstairs of letters of apology pouring into my grandfather from around the Orthodox world, where people said, I'm sorry, I criticized you. I didn't realize your words had been misreported. But before that had come to light, Rav Gifter sends a handwritten letter in Hebrew to the whole faculty, where he says, I know I spoke very harshly, but zolo haita hatkafa ishit. It wasn't a personal attack, but anytime a Talmud Chacham is motzi divrei hevel shtus ruach, you have to protest. So he said. So my grandfather sort of like notated on the side. He said, at least he thinks I'm a Talmud Chacham. But my grandfather had an exceptionally warm relationship and had deep admiration for Rav Aaron Kotler. Rav Aaron Kotler's Zatzal, who was the Rosh Yeshiva of Lakewood. We don't have time to go into it now, but he had a wonderful set of interactions with Rav Aaron actually just before he passed away, which my grandfather always saw as an incredible. My grandfather saw Rav Aaron as an incredible study in intellectual greatness and also intellectual humility. So he really deeply admired him and had a wonderful relationship with him. And of course, I would add that my grandfather's his grandfather, who was his first Rebbe, even before Rav Soloveitchik Zatzal, Rabbi Yeshua Balmel, was the Rosh Yeshiva of Vizhnitz. And so when my great grandfather's Chuvos, the Emek Halacha, were republished, that was a joint effort between my grandfather and the Vizhnitzer Rebbe. So it was those were two connections that he had.
First of all, those are beautiful recollections, of course, and it's amazing to see all the comments in the chat echoing what I think we're all feeling, which is not only was that an incredible tribute to who he was, but you have, carried the mantle of his thought in such a dignified and spirited way. It's really an incredible tribute to him tonight, as it has been to learn with you always. I just want to close with a personal experience that I had with Rabbi Lamm. I wonder, Rav Ari, if you know this story or you don't. This was long before I had any inclination that I might end up in Riverdale. This was maybe 5 or 6 or 7 years ago, and I think someone involved in this story might actually be on the Zoom tonight, but I won't mention any names. Someone from the Jewish Center community on the Upper West Side married someone whose family lives here in Riverdale. And that's why I was thinking of this story. And I believe that Rabbi Yossi Levine was officiating at that wedding, and the family was very, very close with your grandfather from his days as the rabbi of the shul. They really respected him, as many in the Jewish Center did, really, as the most important religious influence in their lives. Your grandfather wasn't particularly well, but they really wanted him to be there, and he wanted to be there. And they asked if I, as the assistant rabbi, would serve as one of the 8-day Kiddushin. And then they asked your grandfather if he was up to coming up to the chuppah to serve as one of the 8-day Kiddushin as well. That's the only reason I know this story. So as everyone knows, 8-day Kiddushin can't be related to the chassan or the kala. That makes them pasal eidos. And your grandfather, who had incredible wit to the very end, were standing there under the chuppah. And I believe Rabbi Levine said to both of us in the formal way that he normally would, he said, "Are either of you related to the chassan or the kala?" And without missing a beat, Rabbi Lamm said, "Unfortunately not." And I wonder if that's what he always said. I'm sure he used that line before, but to me it was one of those amazing aspects of him that may be lost in some of the Svarim and all of the incredible thinking. It was just his deep humanity and his love for his congregants and his love for the Jewish people. They really were, if they weren't family, it was unfortunately not the case, but they certainly felt like he was their family. And we felt like he was ours. Tonight was a beautiful tribute to him. I know we'll continue to learn and be inspired by his legacy for many, many years to come. I want to thank everyone for joining us this evening. Remind you that if you registered for tonight, you're registered for the entire series, and we hope that you will join us next Wednesday evening. We will be celebrating the incredible life and legacy of Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs with Rabbi Gideon Black, who's a former rabbinic intern here at the RJC, and a close personal student of Rabbi Sachs, along with our very own Chazan Shim Kramer. We hope it'll be musical and educational and a real personal insight into who Rabbi Sachs was, both educationally and his relationship as a teacher and mentor to so many. So we really thank everyone for being here tonight, and we look forward to learning with you again next Wednesday evening. Good night to one and all, and we hope to see you in person very soon.